So now we'll look at the classifications of tropics between the wet tropics, the wet dry tropics like here at Raktamachat, and what's known as monsoon tropics. So what are the wet tropics? Well, these are the river basins and wet coast from the latitudes 0 to 25 degrees. Their major locales are in the Amazon and the Congo basins, Central America, Sri Lanka, Malaya, Borneo coast, and New Guinea. So this is where we're going to see wet all the time, tropical. So the temperature is not going to drop below 18. They're going to have moisture all year long, and we would just say it's tropic. This climate covers about 10% of our Earth surface. 5% of the human population lives in these conditions, and it's heavily occupied only where it's terraced with alkaline volcanic soils enables sustained cultivation. So what is that? They only sustain populations here when they can terrace, right, a mountainside, and they grow rice functionally or taro. So these are, if we don't see that type of cultivation, then there's not very big populations. So it's very difficult climate, and this system of agriculture traditionally allowed more people to live in those particular regions. So the wet tropics. Well, there's recent tendency for catastrophic wildfires to develop in logged areas such as Borneo, and for soils to be leached to low fertile and eroded to fairy creek. So what is this happening? When they come in and they cut the jungle, the soils are so poor when the rains come, in this instance, what the white you see is stone. All of the soil eroded away to where you're just seeing the bedrock. Okay, and this is in Borneo. So we have a pristine jungle, a beautiful place. They clear it, the rains come, and in 1 year, all the soil washed away. And you can't really fix it. So this is problems where it's, to clear jungles in these particular types of conditions is just to sell the wood is near crazy. So we have to be really careful if we as designers go into these conditions about clearing trees for particular agricultural uses. So growth is rapid in these areas if you can work with it, uninterrupted and continuous. So year round we can grow. But because of that, we have more problems with insects and birds. They're plentiful. So insects year round, makes lots of birds. So like in Australia, great growing conditions in some of the subtropical areas, but there's so many birds and bats that you have to actually put nets over the fruit tree. And if you don't put a net over your fruit tree, the birds and bats will eat all your fruit. So that can cost a lot of money to try to protect against those, especially in an organic situation. So most fauna is nocturnal and arboreal, and there's abundant fish and aquatic species, lots of nutrient cycling. There's ground grazers are very rare, so there's not as many what we see as mammals as we do in temperate climates. And there's a herd species normally don't occur, so we don't see cows and buffaloes as much as we may see in other climates, so in these areas. So how can we as a designer look at that particular tropic and what might we look for? Well, design elements that you can incorporate. Hygienic feces disposal, where if you do put herding animals that have been introduced to this area, how are you going to deal with their feces? Because you're going to bring them in and you have to corral them. Typically in these areas, they do what's called cut and carry. The cow doesn't walk to eat the grass. The grasses that grow in the tropical areas don't grow that way. So they're really big, like the grass we have here called elephant grass is the common name. So it grows to 3 meters tall in 1 year. So the cow doesn't walk into the grass because if he does, it'll knock it over and he can't eat it because it's a stalk, right? So he can't actually forage for it because he wasn't designed to forage that grass. Elephants were. So at this point, they have to cut it and feed it to him, and then that makes manure pile. So how are you going to dispose of it? Well, a great way for us is to make compost, right? So I can feed to the herbivore, I can create compost, but we need to design that into our system. We need clean water sources. If you do, again, bring in animal systems, how are you going to clean the water for those particular animals? You need to integrate and have a benign insect control technique, meaning that there's lots of insects in the tropics, and if we're going to do organics, how do we mitigate that we still have some food? Well, in our garden, I don't know if some of you have noticed, but we have some flowers inside, like cosmos, aster. And these flowers attract beneficial insects. So wasps, for instance, will come into the garden and be attracted to those particular flowers, and while they're there, they predate on the bugs. So we help to use natural biological controls. So think about what is a beneficial insect that's going to control the, say, pest. We can have gradual replacement of our ground crops by trees. So over time, and this is kind of walk before you run, if I take over all of Raktamachat, and we bought it, it's great, but I can't possibly plant all the trees. We planted 16,000 trees so far. I couldn't plant those all in 1 year. It's not possible. So I have to do it in phases. Year 1, year 2, year 3. So I roll myself into eventually I've covered everything in trees and I've taken out the annuals. So 100% annuals to eventually annuals under trees. We can have preservation of any natural tree stands. So if there are trees, don't cut them down. And development of river versus road traffic. In a lot of these areas, we can find that the rivers, especially like in the Amazon, are great ways to transport goods in a not impactful way. And we can have evolution of natural products. What does that mean? More eco products. How can we look at developing so people through marketing would be more interested to use natural products instead of, say, more processed or synthetic products? And no dig, mulch, means that we don't turn the soils. Maybe only, say, in our intensive agriculture or garden, we may turn the soil to put in compost. But in the broad scale, we're never going to go turn over the soil. The only thing is if I was to plant something, I may dig a small hole, I'll plant the tree, and I put it back and I put mulch. I'm never going to have exposed soils. And domestic foragers for snails and insect pests. For instance, allowing your chickens or ducks into your garden, and they will keep down the pests, say snails. So ducks love snails. Bill Mollison had a great quote. He said, if you have a snail problem, right, do you actually have a snail problem or do you have a duck deficiency? You don't have enough ducks. That's why you have a snail problem. That's his concept, that the problem is the solution. So if you can say, I have this problem, then his question was, yeah, but what would solve that problem? So your problem is you don't have enough ducks. If you had more ducks, you wouldn't have a problem with snails. So appropriate medicinal plants. The tropics is really easy to grow plants for self-curing, if you will. Whether it's eating moringa in our stir fry or any types of teas that someone may want to grow, or balms, or Lynn can give you the powder for your leg that she probably grows because she's very into medicinal things like that. So these are things where I can save money by self-medicating. So wet, dry tropics, well, these adjoin the wet tropics, but are a poleward of them. So they're north or south of those. They take up about 15% of our Earth, and they're from the 0 to 25%, and they're unbalanced in favor of the southern hemisphere, meaning there's more in the southern hemisphere than we find in the northern hemisphere. So the areas that we can find these are in South America, Central America, the Congo Basin, the Pacific Islands of Hawaii, for instance, and most of these can be developed for grazing animals. So in the subtropics, we start to see grasses forming that can support grazing animals without cut and carry regimes like in tropical areas. Because the tropical areas, the grasses that dominate there aren't associated with herbaceous animals. So the wet, dry tropics, we have a landscape of intermediate patchy streams, lots of stream flow, some wadis and floodplains, and areas of sinkholes, kinets, absence, and surface water. So this is a basically picture of the Yucatan in Mexico, where we see this type of patchy topography, which can hold water and lots of different things going on. So hills are rounded, and this is due typically to erosion over geologic timescales. There's lots of erosion in this particular area. So extensive land and swamps. So now the wet, dry tropics. Well, that's more kind of similar to where Thailand is associated with. Savannas, we can see that also in Africa. So these regions contain the vast savanna grasslands of the tropics with thornbush and flat-topped acacia trees. The trees that are on our road, the big trees, those are acacia trees, by the way. So these trees are also native to Africa. And they have steepy grasslands, plateaus, bamboos, and dry deciduous trees. So the grasses in this area can reach 1 to 6 meters tall. So one grass growing to 6 meters tall. So it's a very interesting grassland situation. So more associated when we say wet, dry to grasslands. If it's wet tropics, that's more trees. So if most of the problem here is that if people come in and they burn the grasslands, then they have exposed soils. And African areas contain enormous numbers of herd species. Because of the grass association with the wet, dry, we see the herbaceous animals. So the safari, you go there, you have all of these herbaceous animals migrating across Africa. So that could be zebra, gnu, antelope, and any other large carnivores that are going to actually track those animals. So herbaceous animals have what's called a predator-prey relationship. That means that they have animals that push them, and they herd together for protection, and the tiger wants to eat them, right? Not a tiger, actually a lion in Africa, right? So the lion wants to eat them, and the lion is always stalking it, and they're moving all the time. So this is something that we need to understand when we're in these situations, to understand their natural movements. So what can we do to design for that particular climate? Well, we can use small domestic water storage. When we see these areas, the people have problems with water. It doesn't rain as much. It's the wet, dry. So in the dry season, we need to design ability to hold water through the dry season. We can intercrop with legume trees such as acacia. Acacia is a great tree. Remember I told you our tree drops leaves year-round, right? So it gives me shade, and it gives me a year-long supply of basically mulch. So acacia trees are great trees to use in these situations. I can use the acacia tree also if I intercrop between them for dapple shading. Right? The big problem around some of these areas is that what happens is the people need firewood. So they go out and guess what they do? Cut down the closest tree. And the next day they come down and then all of a sudden there's a settlement, but around the settlement there's no trees. Well, actually we need to reintroduce the trees to our gardens because it helps to give us shade from the intense sunlight. Natural herding systems of any local species can be developed. Mulch in the grasses. So if we do take the grasses, we could cut the grasses, not burn them, and use them as a natural mulch, especially in our gardens. And we can increase the tree crop of high forage value. So if we were to go there, we could help with saying, well, look, what if we bring in a high value tree so that you can bring up trees and you would value the tree more for the tree than for firewood. So people would be less likely to want to cut it down. No tillage. Well, this is called cut and mulch or grain techniques. So don't till the grain. You can sow the grain under the mulch. So that works in these areas because they grow grass so well. This is more of the Masaoma Fukuoka technique of basically do nothing farming. You can use chisel plows or sod seeding techniques. You can also do reclamation of eroded lands using any pioneer species. So in these areas, they have lots of species, legumes, that grow really fast. So if I can put in those species, they grow so fast, I can get biomass. So now that I can grow biomass quickly, I can make compost. And I can start to work on the soils. So we see that a pioneer species basically grows mass for us very easily. We could do keyline techniques, so if there's any flood problems, sometimes these places have flood control problems, we could keyline the land to let the water infiltrate. Our tree foragers are small hand feed things. So introducing that if we do have herding animals, we can control the herding animal, and if we create fodder banks, we're able to feed the animal, and then we have access to the manure. With the access to the manure, then I can make compost. So now I can see where if I have fodder trees associated with legumes, I can now get my greens and my manures. I can make compost, and with compost, I can change the soil conditions to grow more vegetables and herbs for human consumption. So if we do all that stuff, then we can use manures in our gardens and with development of domestic fuel wood sources, meaning that there's certain trees that are associated called trees that can be pollarded or coppiced. So I'm going to give you a little bit of how to remember this. If I have a tree that can be coppiced, I take the tree and I draw a big C. The C would come down and cut me off at my feet, right? And then I'll grow back. So I cut the whole tree down, nothing's left, just a stump. And that type of tree will actually grow back from the stump. And next year, I can cut it. And a great example from a temperate climate most people know is the willow tree. If I cut the willow tree completely down, just a stump, it grows back. And next year, I cut it and it grows back. So that tree is a great type of tree because if I put it in, by actually cutting it to make firewood, it grows back. Other trees that do similar is called a pollarding tree. So a tree that doesn't like to be coppiced but could be pollarded means that if I have a tree and I draw a big P, the P would cut me here, cut my head off, right? A pollarding tree, which means that if I stand like this and you cut me here, my arms grow back. And then my arms grow back, and my arms grow back. So the tree never dies. So trees that can be coppiced or pollarded, if introduced, and lots of these trees are legumes, so they fix nitrogen. So they're fixing nitrogen and they grow back. So then if we can plant those near to the village, the firewood that they need grows back. If you cut down a tree and it doesn't grow back, right? Well, it doesn't take long and there's no trees, right? Which is a big problem. So monsoon tropics, where are they located? Where here we see this is called a subtype of the wet, dry tropics, but they're influenced by nearby continental land masses or oceanic winds. So what happens here is there's some kind of wind condition or a mountain range. So when the monsoon comes over, like here in Thailand, it comes over the plateau that we live, this is called the Karat Plateau. So the monsoon typically blows over the plateau, but when it gets to near here, it's about an hour away, called Khio Mountain, it hits that mountain and then it stops. And they get lots more rain than us, maybe twice as much. So lots of rain because of the mountain, and we have lots less rain because we're on the plateau and we get blown over. So these places are confined typically to what they call Indo-Thailand region, Northern Australia, East Java, Timor, South New Guinea, and North India. So let's look at the monsoon tropics. So despite only about 8 to 10% of the land surface, the monsoon areas contain large human populations. So they're not very big, but lots of people living there. Temperatures rise and the hot, dry winds develop and can get up to 38 degrees Celsius in spring, and then the heat increasing until the onset of the monsoon. And last year, at least the temperature reading that was on one of the students' phones said 43. So we had to 43. It's really hot, super dry, dust everywhere. Okay, so we have this lushness with rain, and the other extreme is super hot, super dry, and lots of dust. So what do we do here? Well, in this type of environment, floods and droughts are equally unpredictable. So we don't know if this year is going to be a flood and or a drought, but they're common. Most activities are determined by the monsoon rain based on fishing and farming. So what happens is the monsoon comes and we have a lot of flooding around, and then the little fish basically proliferate, right? And then after 3 months, the water starts to soak in and everyone goes around and catches all the little fish, right? Maybe from 1 inch to 4 inches or something, right? Lots of them, thousands of these little fish. And then they take them and they put them in a big bucket, right? And they just leave them in the bucket and they die. And then they start to rot, yeah? And break down. And then they rot completely away until there's just a bottom layer. And that top juice that forms on top, that's called fish sauce. So, yeah, that's how they make fish sauce. They rot fish. It's the Asian version of cheese, right? Because Asians, they smell cheese and they're like, that's nasty, right? And for us, fish sauce, before they make it, which is called pala. So that's what they do. They get that from the rice fields, and that's how they sustain themselves, because then they have protein. So they can have the protein that holds over when there's no rain. Yeah? So the tree canopy here is less dense than in what is called the wet tropics, and its dense understories develop. There's also mangroves that may form on river edges or on the low coast. The soils are what's called laterite. That's why the soils here are very red, and even sometimes you see red stones. They're often very hard in the dry season, so all the moisture dries out. So you have clay with stone, very dense, almost like digging in concrete. Okay, and they have very low nutrient status. So the stones here, laterite, doesn't have a lot of minerals, right? It's almost like sandstone. It's not very minerals, not like granites that we see in temperate climates that have been eroded by the glaciers, so you have a lot of mineral content. Here, very low. That's why it's so much that I focus on adding minerals to our garden, because we have very low mineral soils. So design elements are similar to those in the wet, dry tropics though. So whatever we might have looked at in tropics areas work also here, but we also need to look at more dry land strategies. So we can kind of think about here as 2 climates. Sometimes it's tropics and sometimes it's a desert. Literally, cactus grow here and stuff like around. So in the prevailing area, they have cactus. The agave cactus that you use to make tequila grows naturally. So very dry, also tropical, same time.